Welcome to Dostoevsky Untold. Today we will be reading The Peasant Mary by well-renowned Russian author and existentialist Fyodor Dostoevsky. This channel is dedicated to the writings of Fyodor Dostoevsky, including discussing the existential literature and reading some of his works as well, with the attempt to spread the genius, existential depth, and richness of characters and psychological insights that Fyodor Dostoevsky has to offer with as many people as possible. If you like today's video, please leave a like and subscribe. Without further ado, The Peasant Mary. It was Easter Monday. The air was warm, the sky blue, the sun high, warm and bright. But I was plunged into gloom. I wandered aimlessly behind the barracks in the prison yard, looking at the palings of the strong prison fence, counting them mechanically, though I did not particularly want to count them, but doing it more out of a habit than anything else. It was the second day of holidays in prison. The convicts were not taken out to work. Lots of them were drunk. Cursing and quarreling broke out every minute in different corners of the prison. Disgusting coarse songs. Groups of convicts playing cards under their bunks. Several convicts who had run amok and had been dealt with summarily by their own comrades were lying half dead on the bunks covered with sheepskins until they should recover consciousness. The knives had already been drawn several times. All this had so harrowing an effect on me during the 2 days of holidays that it made me ill. I could never bear without disgust the wild orgies of the common people, and here, in this place, this was especially true. On such days even the officials never looked into the prison, carried out no searches, did not look for drinks, realizing that once a year even these outcasts had to be given a chance of enjoying themselves, and that otherwise things would be much, much worse. At last blind fury blazed up in my heart. I met the Pole Minsky, one of the political prisoners. He gave me a black look. With flashing eyes and trembling lips he said, "Je haïs ces brigands," or "I hate these brigands." He hissed at me in an undertone and walked past me. I went back to the barracks, although I had rushed out of them like a madman only a quarter of an hour before, when 6 strong peasants had hurled themselves on the drunken Tartar, Gazin, in an attempt to quieten him, and had begun beating him. They beat him senselessly. A camel might have been killed by such blows, but they knew that it was not easy to kill this Hercules, and they beat him therefore without any qualms. Now on my return, I noticed Gazin lying unconsciously and without any sign of life on a bunk in a corner at the other end of the barracks. He lay covered with a sheepskin, and they all passed by him in silence, knowing very well that if the man was unlucky, he might die from a beating like that. I made my way to my place opposite the window with the iron bars and lay on my back with my eyes closed and my hands behind my head. I liked to lie like that. No one would bother a sleeping man, and meanwhile one could dream and think. But I found it difficult to dream. My heart was beating uneasily, and Minsky's words were still echoing in my ears. Je haïs ces brigands. However, why dwell on these scenes? I sometimes even now dream of those times at night, and none of my dreams is more agonizing. Perhaps it will be noticed that to this day I have hardly ever spoken in print of my life in prison. The House of the Dead I wrote 15 years ago, in the person of a fictitious character who is supposed to have killed his wife. I may add, incidentally, just as an interesting detail, that many people have thought and have been maintaining ever since the publication of that book of mine, that I was sent to Siberia for the murder of my wife. By and by, I did forget my surroundings and became imperceptibly lost in memories. During the 4 years of my imprisonment, I was continually recalling my past and seemed in my memories to live my former life all over again. These memories cropped up by themselves. I seldom evoked them consciously. It would begin from some point, some imperceptible feature, which then grew little by little into a complete picture, into some clear-cut and vivid impression. I used to analyze those impressions, adding new touches to an event that had happened long ago, and above all, correcting it incessantly, and that constituted my chief amusement. This time, I for some reason suddenly remembered one fleeting instant in my early childhood, when I was only 9 years old, an instant that I seemed to have completely forgotten. But at the time I was particularly fond of memories of my early childhood. I remembered an August day in our village, a dry, bright day, though rather cold and windy. Summer was drawing to a close, and we should soon have to leave for Moscow, and again have to spend all winter over the boring French lessons, and I was so sorry to leave the country. I walked past the threshing floors, and, going down a ravine, climbed up into the dense thicket of bushes which stretched from the other side of the ravine to the wood. I got amongst the bushes, and I could hear not very far away, about 30 yards perhaps, a peasant ploughing by himself on a clearing. I knew he was ploughing up the steep slope of a hill. The horse must have found it very hard going, for from time to time I heard the peasant call from a distance, "Gee up, gee up." I knew almost all our peasants, but I did not know which of them was ploughing now, nor did it really matter to me who it was, because I was occupied with my own affairs. I too was busy, breaking off a switch from a hazel tree to strike frogs with. Hazel twigs are very lovely, but they are also very brittle, much more brittle than birch tree twigs. I was also interested in beetles and other insects, and I was collecting them. Some of them were very beautiful. I also liked the small, quick red and yellow lizards with black spots, but I was afraid of snakes. However, there are many fewer snakes than lizards in the area. There are not many mushrooms there. To get mushrooms one had to go to the birchwood, and I was about to go there. And there was nothing in the world I loved so much as the wood with its mushrooms and wild berries, its beetles and its birds, its hedgehogs and its squirrels, and its damp smell of rotten leaves. And even as I write this, I can smell the fragrance of our birchwood. These impressions remain with you for your whole life. Suddenly, amid the dead silence, I heard clearly and distinctly the shout, "Wolf! Wolf!" I uttered a shriek, and panic-stricken, screamed at the top of my voice, and rushed out to the clearing, straight to the ploughing peasant. It was our Peasant Mary. I didn't know if there is such a name, but everybody called him Mary. He was a peasant of about 50, thick-set and over medium height, with a large, grizzled, dark brown beard. I knew him, but till that day I had scarcely ever spoken to him. When he heard my cry, he even stopped his old mare, and when, unable to stop myself, I clutched at his wooden plough with one hand, and at his sleeve with the other, he saw how terrified I was. "There's a wolf there!" I cried breathlessly. He threw up his head and looked round involuntarily, for a moment almost believing me. "Where's the wolf?" "Someone shouted just now, 'Wolf! Wolf!'" I stammered. There are no wolves hereabouts," he murmured, trying to calm me. "You've been dreaming, sonny. Who ever heard of wolves in these parts?" But I was trembling all over, and I was still clutching at his smocket, and I suppose I must have been very pale. He looked at me with a worried smile, evidently anxious and troubled about me. Dear, how frightened you are," he said, shaking his head. "Don't be frightened, sonny. Oh, you poor thing, you. There. He stretched out his hand and suddenly stroked my cheek. "There now, Christ be with you. Cross yourself. There's a good lad." but I did not cross myself. The corners of my mouth were still twitching, and that seemed to strike him particularly. He quietly stretched out his thick finger with its black nail, smeared with earth, and gently touched my trembling lips. Dear, oh dear, he smiled at me with a slow, motherly sort of smile. Lord, how frightened he is, the poor lad. I realized at last that there was no wolf, and that I had imagined the shout, "Wolf! Wolf!" The shout, though, was very clear and distinct, but such shouts, and not only about wolves, I had imagined once or twice before, and I knew it. I grew up out of these hallucinations a few years later. "Well, I'll go now," I said, looking at him questioningly and shyly. Run along, son. I'll be a-watching you," he said, adding, "Don't you worry. I shan't let the wolf get you." And he smiled at me with the same motherly smile. "Well, Christ be with you. Run along, sonny." And he made the sign of the cross over me, and then crossed himself too. I walked away, looking back anxiously every few yards. While I was walking away, Marey stood still with his mare and looked after me, nodding his head at me every time I looked around. As a matter of fact, I was a little ashamed of myself for having let him see how frightened I was, but I was still very much afraid of the wolf as I was walking away, till I climbed up the steep side of the ravine and came to the first threshing barn. There my terror left me completely, and our watchdog, Volschok, suddenly appeared out of nowhere and rushed at me. With Volschok at my side, I completely recovered my spirits and turned round to Marey for the last time. I could no longer see his face clearly, but I felt that he was still nodding and smiling tenderly at me. I waved to him, and he waved back to me, and started his mare. "Gee up!" I heard his call in the distance again, and the mare pulled at the wooden plough once more. All this came back to me all at once. I don't know why, but with an amazing accuracy of detail, I suddenly came to and sat up on my bunk, and I remember I could still feel the gentle smile of memory on my lips. For another minute I went on recalling that incident from childhood. When I returned home from Marey that day, I did not tell anybody about my adventure. It was not much of an adventure anyway, and besides, I soon forgot all about Marey. Whenever I happened to come across him now and then, I never spoke to him either about the wolf or anything else. And now 20 years later in Siberia, I suddenly remembered this meeting so distinctly that not a single detail of it was lost, which means, of course, that it must have been hidden in my mind without my knowing it, of itself and without any effort on my part, and it came back to me suddenly when it was wanted. I remember the tender, motherly smile of that serf, the way he made the sign of the cross over me and crossed himself, the way he nodded at me. Lord, how afeard he is, the poor lad. And particularly that thick finger of his, smeared with earth, with which he touched my twitching lips so gently and with such shy tenderness. No doubt anyone would have done his best to calm a child, but something quite different seemed to have happened during that solitary meeting, and if I had been his own son, he could not have looked at me with eyes shining with brighter love. And who compelled him to look like that? He was one of our serfs, a peasant who was our property, and after all I was the son of his master. No one would have known that he had been so good to me, and no one would have rewarded him for it. Did he really love little children as much as that? There are such people, no doubt. Our meeting took place in a secluded spot, in a deserted field, and only God perhaps saw from above with what profound and enlightened human feeling, and with what delicate, almost womanly tenderness, the heart of a coarse, savagely ignorant Russian serf was filled. A serf who at the time neither expected nor dreamt of his emancipation. Tell me, was not this what Konstantin Akaskov perhaps meant when he spoke of the high degree of culture of our people. And so when I got off the bunk and looked round, I suddenly I remember, that I could look at these unhappy creatures with quite different eyes, and that suddenly, by some miracle, all hatred and anger had vanished from my heart. I walked round the prison, peering into the faces I came across. That rascal of a peasant with his shaven head and branded face, yelling his horse-drunken song at the top of his voice. Why, he too may be the same sort of peasant as Marey. I cannot possibly look into his heart, can I? That evening I again met the Polminski. Poor man, he could have no memory about Marey, or peasants like him, and he could have no other opinion of these people except Je hais ces brigands. Yes, it was much harder for those Poles than for us. This marks the end of the recording by Fyodor Dostoevsky, The Peasant Mary. I hope you have enjoyed this recording, and if you did, please leave a like and subscribe. That's all for today. I hope to see you again in the future.